All right, Scott, I think we can probably get started.
All right, sounds good. Thank you. Let me just double check and make sure I'm sharing my screen properly. All right. All right, perfect. Good morning, everyone. My name is Scott Reef. I am a safety consultant for a commercial insurance broker called Marsh & McLennan Agency out of the States here, and we work with MultiTech. And although we are an insurance broker, we have a small safety team that I'm a part of. There's 9 of us that go out and we kind of help do different trainings like this. We'll do the WHMIS training, GHS, everything you see on the screen here. We'll also go out and help do other safety trainings and walkthroughs and things of that nature. So that's just a little bit of background on me. But today we are going to go ahead and do WHMIS training, as I mentioned. So that is the Workplace Hazardous Materials Information System. We're going to talk a little bit about GHS, which was sort of recently, back in 2015, kind of incorporated into the WHMIS program. We'll get into more detail about what that is, but largely this all relates to hazardous chemicals and hazardous agents in the workplace. So we will go through that. And then at the end, we will kind of touch on some protective measures and some other safety related things that are just good to know and good to bring to the workplace on a daily basis. So before we get started, it is helpful. We can kind of compile a list at the end of the training here through Zoom, but it's also helpful if you can just throw your name in the chat. If you can do your first and your last name, that kind of helps us just make sure that we're accounting for everybody. So if you have a chance to do that, that is very helpful for us. All right, so to get started, WHMIS came about in 1988, so October 31st, 1988. And then more recently in 2015, kind of adopted this GHS standard, which again, we're going to get a little bit further into. And to give you a little bit more background on the GHS, the Globally Harmonized System, was sort of a chemical labeling system that almost every country in the world has adopted. I think it's like 95% or even greater than that at this point. And the whole idea was to kind of standardize chemical safety so that whether I'm in Canada or I'm in the United States or wherever I happen to be, everybody's kind of looking at the same thing and everybody's kind of getting the same information. So to touch on that a little bit more, the main difference that you're going to see is if we kind of rewind back to 1988 and the standards prior to 2015, you're going to see these different pictures that kind of identify the different hazards that we have. And in general, there's previously there were 10 of them. When we start talking about the GHS system, which is the little red and black diamond that you see on the right-hand side there, there's actually 9 of those. So previously there were 10, now there's 9 specifically, but we're going to kind of touch on all of that. That's going to be the main difference between the old system and the new system. And with that being said, we're going to cover 4 aspects of it because it's important for us to kind of be familiar with the old and the new, because although it was kind of brought about and implemented in 2015, sometimes that takes a little bit of time, right? So it's been 6 years, but some of the old systems still exist. So you're still going to see some of those symbols, and you're still going to see, or you're going to be seeing some of the new symbols as we kind of work towards migrating towards full GHS compliance. So with that being said, kind of what we'll start out with today is what we call risk control fundamentals. And these are going to be the basics of just safety in general, hazards, basically how safety people like me take a look at hazards that happen or injuries that might take place. So what you see on the screen right now is called the hierarchy of controls. And this is sort of a model that has different layers that we can use. So when we think about a hazard, and let's just take a chemical hazard, for example. So maybe we have a really corrosive chemical that's in the workplace. So as we work down these different layers, I'm going to give some examples of what we might do with that chemical to kind of protect ourselves or protect others. So going down this model, at the very top, you're going to see that we have elimination. And basically, this is the top layer. This is going to be the most effective way that we can eliminate a hazard in the workplace. So can we physically remove the hazard? Next, we have substitution, which basically looks at, can we find something, like in the case of this chemical, can we find another chemical that we can substitute out that maybe it's not quite as hazardous as this chemical, right? So this one that this example I'm mentioning is maybe really corrosive, maybe it's explosive, maybe it's got all 9 of the pictograms that we're going to talk about later. Maybe we can find a similar chemical that does the exact same job, but maybe doesn't have all those hazards associated with it. So that's going to be our second most effective method. So we've got elimination, then we've got substitution, and then we have engineering controls. And engineering controls, we're going to take a look at, can we somehow physically separate people from the hazard? So that could mean physical barriers that block them from accessing the harmful chemical agent that we're talking about. It could be, say this chemical is very corrosive and we happen to have a big bucket of it, or a big vat of it of sorts, right? And there's vapors coming off of it and mists. And, we probably don't have that right in the office space or things like that. But just kind of as an example, if we do have that, we might put an engineering control in where we put ventilation over that, right? And that ventilation is going to take the fumes and everything from that chemical, and it's going to suck it outside so that we're not exposed to it. So again, that's sort of an engineering control, or that's a physical control that we could put into place. So when we take a look at this model, these top 3, the elimination, the substitution, and the engineering controls, these are going to be the most effective methods that we can kind of apply to the workplace, whether we're talking about chemical hazards or any other types of hazards. Now, as we work our way down, and as you see on the left-hand side, we started at most effective, kind of all the way down to least effective. We've got that bar on the side there. And when we kind of crawl towards the bottom, you see administrative controls. And administrative controls can certainly be effective. And administrative controls would be things like we're doing today, like training. We might put up posters. We might have short safety meetings before a shift starts. We might have written policies and procedures surrounding safety and chemical hazards and such that we put into place. And those are all very important things. The reason administrative controls kind of falls towards the bottom of this pyramid is because there's a human element that goes with this. And what that means is I can do all the training that I want, and I can write all the policies and all the procedures that I want. But at the end of the day, it's kind of up to the human to kind of understand that, interpret that information, and then follow that information and follow those rules. So administrative control is important, but we are kind of working our way down from an effectiveness standpoint. And then at the bottom, you see PPE. And again, I don't want to discount the importance of PPE, or personal protective equipment, because it is important. If you're working with chemicals, you want to make sure that you're wearing gloves. You want to make sure that you maybe have eye protection on. We want to make sure that maybe we're wearing masks, things of that nature. PPE is important. The reason that falls at the very bottom of the pyramid is because it's kind of it's a frontline measure to protect ourselves. So it's kind of like the last line of defense. And the example that I like to give with this is, I'm a pretty good safety guy, but I think back to earlier this summer, I installed a faucet on our kitchen sink just right here at home. And I'm a good safety guy, so I put on my safety glasses and I'm laying underneath the sink. And sure enough, as I'm kind of taking things apart, things are still able to get behind my glasses and kind of get into my eye. So they are certainly protective and they certainly help. They're not always 100% effective. And that's the reason why it's kind of layered in this fashion, in this upside down pyramid here. So that's the hierarchy of controls, which kind of leads into what we're going to call employee right to know. Sometimes this is called, or what's known as, hazard communication. But at the end of the day, what we're talking about here is an employee's right to know what. So what, as an employee, do you have a right to know, or do you have a right to understand in your workplace? So largely what we're going to talk about today is this first kind of bolded bullet point here. So the routine exposure to hazardous substances. So what substances are in the workplace that might be hazardous, from a chemical standpoint or other. And then we'll also talk about the harmful physical agents that people may be exposed to in the workplace. And some of these may be applicable, some of them might not be. But when we talk about harmful physical agents, we're talking about, maybe situations where you might be in excessive heat or maybe excessive noise, and kind of what that looks like. And then we'll also touch very briefly on infectious agents. So bloodborne pathogens and what you might do in a situation where there might be a bloodborne pathogen type exposure. So along with that, as part of the WHMIS program, employees also have a right to participate. And basically what that means is workers have the right to make recommendations about health and safety. Now with that, most organizations are going to have what's called a joint health and safety committee. So basically they got the safety committee in place. And as part of the safety committee, generally management is going to participate, employees are going to participate, and those employees are going to be from different departments and kind of different walks of life within the organization. And what that does is that brings different perspectives to the safety committee to kind of give kind of a full and broad, overview and just offer those different perspectives on what we might do to improve health and safety. Okay, so along with that, workers on the safety committee also have the right to participate in the Ministry of Labor inspections. So Ministry of Labor comes in and they're doing an inspection. Workers on that committee have a right to participate in that as well. And then finally, employees, just keep in mind, employees always have the right to refuse work. And that's if you believe that you're in a situation or there's something that is around you that kind of endangers your safety and health. And if you're in that type of situation, again, you have the right to refuse work, but what you want to do is bring that up to management, work with them, and get that situation or that hazard corrected before work actually proceeds so that we're keeping ourselves safe. So jumping in, what is a health hazard? So what I'm going to talk about here is we have health hazards, and I'm going to jump forward here, and then we have a little farther, and then we have safety hazards as well. So when I talk about health hazards, I'm kind of talking about more of the internal type damage and hazards that can happen. So what I'd like to point out here is, obviously this first bullet point, we have carcinogens, which would be cancer-causing agents, things that are mutagenics, right? They might change cell structure. So there's certain agents or chemicals that you could be exposed to that might be cancerous. There's toxic or highly toxic agents, so poisonous things. Really, if you kind of shoot to the bottom, really any agent that's going to damage the lungs, your skin, your eyes, anything internally like that is going to be what's known as a health hazard. All right. So a few more examples of health effects. What I really want to detail out here is that there's acute health effects and then there's chronic health effects. And acute health effects, if something is acutely dangerous, if a chemical is acutely dangerous to you, it's going to do a lot of damage in a very short amount of time. So even exposures at 15 minutes or even less can cause the things that you see on the screen. So damage to tissue, irritation, dry skin, everything that you see there. Even that bottom arrow there, it can be lethal dosages as well. So there are some things out there that ideally we don't have in the workplace currently that can be, fairly toxic and potentially lethal in small doses like that. And then we also have chronic health effects. So chronic health effects are going to be those health effects that kind of occur over a long period of time. So if you think about all the things you see on the screen, primarily cancer, asbestos, these things that take a potentially long time to develop, but are very serious and can be life-threatening. That's when we get into the chronic side of things. So we have acute, and then we have chronic. So what I kind of want to demonstrate here with health hazards is you see a couple things on the screen. You see on the left-hand side a bar of soap, which the majority of us have in our house, right? And in that bar of soap is what's called, the common term for it is lye, also known as sodium hydroxide. And this is a chemical that in really strong concentrations, if I get that on my skin, it's going to cause my hand or whatever part of the skin that it lands on to look basically like the picture on the right-hand side. So if you picture the person that's working on the right-hand side there, that's the person that's working with the sodium hydroxide kind of day in, day out. And this person probably isn't using PPE. They're probably not considering those controls that we talked about kind of at the beginning of the training here. So you see, obviously his hand isn't in great condition there and he's probably not feeling so great. So this is the same chemical. So the whole point of this slide is, both are exposures to sodium hydroxide, but on the left-hand side, we have a bar of soap, which is in almost everybody's home, but it's in small doses or small amounts, and we're immediately washing it off. So that exposure level is pretty small. On the right-hand side, same chemical, but a lot higher exposure level and a lot more damage being done. So that's important to keep in mind as we're exposed to chemicals and different agents. And then we also have what are called safety hazards. So safety hazards are what I like to say are more of a external type of hazard, right? So we're talking about slips, trips, and falls. There might be a puddle on the floor, or snow or ice on the ground, right? We might step on that and we might be in a rush, right? And we step on it, we slip, we fall, and we injure ourselves. Struck by, there might be moving objects that fly and end up hitting us. Fires and explosion. You see workplace violence on the bottom. That's kind of sort of a safety hazard that is becoming more and more prominent with active shooter and such. If you think about forklift safety, if you have forklifts in the workplace, all these different kind of external safety hazards that we need to think about and talk about as well. All right, so jumping in here, we have a couple different things. So we have safety data sheets are kind of part of the whole system that we're talking about today, part of the GHS system that's incorporated as well. So in your buildings, you might have a book that sort of looks like what's on the right-hand side of the screen there. And that is a book containing what's called safety data sheets. And if you're not familiar, safety data sheets are essentially, it's a collection of information that is required for any chemical that you might be working with in the workplace. So that chemical comes in. Generally, they're going to include like a physical copy when you buy that chemical of the safety data sheet, or nowadays it's kind of going more electronic. So a lot of times you can go find the PDF or digital copy of it online at the manufacturer's website. And we're going to get into more of the detail on what's actually in a safety data sheet in the next couple of slides here. But ultimately what we're talking about when you start looking at that is, what is the name of the chemical? What are the hazards associated with it? What are first aid measures? What do I do if it starts on fire? That's the kind of information that it's going to give. So the important thing to remember with this is if you're working with a particular chemical on a daily basis, and that could be a variety of different things. It could be just a general cleaner. It could be bleach. Even bleach would come with a safety data sheet. Anything like that is going to have that. So if you're curious and you're working with something pretty frequently, it's a good idea to make sure that you're familiar with the information that's on that particular chemicals sheet. The other thing that you see on the screen here is a labeling system. And this is a GHS compliant label. So I mentioned earlier the globally harmonized system. This is the label that ultimately we're looking to move to, that everybody should kind of be moving to. And what you see on the screen, there's a lot of small words, right? And it's got the hazards associated with in this case, acetone. It's got right here, if you can see my pointer, there's a warning word here, or a signal word is what they call it, sorry. And it's either going to say warning or it's going to say danger. And if it says danger, that's going to be the more severe of the two. It's only going to be basically one of those two words. And then we've got this small print that basically says, hey, here are the hazards associated with it.
Hey Scott, I'm not sure if you can hear me, but we can't hear you.
All right, am I back?
Yep, you're back.
All right, sorry about that, my camera froze up. I think kind of where I left off is I was talking about, I got past flammable, does that sound right? So we're looking at these pictograms and we can tell that acetone is flammable and we can tell that it's an irritant. So if I get it on my skin, again, it might cause a rash, something along those lines. So the great part is I can identify what the hazards of this chemical might be. All right, so information on workplace labels. So here's what's required on a workplace label. So at the very least, we need to have the product name. And then we also need to have safe handling precautions that are on the label. And then we need it to also reference safety data sheets. So basically the most important things, naming the chemical and then the hazards that are associated with it. And then kind of going back to the safety data sheets that we were discussing earlier, with the GHS system, they've standardized safety data sheets. So these used to be called material safety data sheets. They've dropped the material piece of it. So now they're just called safety data sheets, or you'll see SDS. And they've standardized these 16 different sections. And I won't get into extreme detail on all 16 sections, but kind of like I mentioned earlier, you see, section 1 is always going to be identification. And it doesn't matter if we're talking about acetone or bleach or any other chemical that you might be using. When you look at the sheet, it's going to have these 16 different sections. So again, earlier I mentioned first aid. I talked about firefighting, accidental release. If I have a bucket of it and I accidentally kick it over, there might be fumes or other hazards or things that I need to consider. That information as to how I might deal with an accidental release is going to be on that safety data sheet. And same thing with personal protective equipment, proper disposal, everything that you see on the screen here. So here's an example of a safety data sheet that we pulled that you may or may not be working with, but this is flux. So flux generally used for, in this case, I think, soldering. There's some types of flux out there that are used for welding, but this is kind of a general safety data sheet for flux NC 275 that we pulled. And you can see here, generally, it's pretty safe for us. So there's not really much from a prevention standpoint or a response. So they've got not applicable. So basically what that means is this is a pretty safe chemical that we're using, or a pretty safe agent that we're using. All that, not to say that there aren't things that we need to consider. So on this, at the beginning here, I'm kind of in the hazard identification section. But if I move on to section 4, which is the first aid measures that I mentioned earlier, there are some suggestions. So if I do get it in my eye, it's going to tell me to immediately flush eyes with plenty of water. It's going to give me inhalation. What do I do if I breathe it in? What do I do if it contacts my skin? And what do I do if I ingest it? So, maybe I somehow, touched my tongue with my hand, or maybe I was eating a sandwich and I didn't wash my hands, and that chemical gets on the food that I'm ingesting. So it's going to give me kind of all the measures to do if I end up doing that. So again, it's fairly safe, but there are still some things to consider. So kind of piggybacking on that, how are we exposed to chemicals? There's 4 main ways that we're exposed to chemicals. First of which is going to be inhalation. So I can breathe it in. So if I think about, let's talk about bleach water. So with COVID, a lot of companies out there are sanitizing using bleach water. So they'll put a small amount of bleach, mix it with water, and they'll put it in what's called a secondary container, which is essentially a spray bottle. And when I spray that bottle, it kind of mists into the air, right? So the first thing that can potentially happen is I can breathe that in. And that might be one route that a chemical enters my body. Second would be absorption. And absorption is going to be if a chemical lands on my skin, it can be absorbed into the bloodstream. Kind of a similar mentality to, say, like a nicotine patch. If I put a nicotine patch on my skin, the whole idea behind that is it absorbs into my bloodstream. Similar idea, right? If it lands on my skin and it stays there long enough, depending on the chemical, that can be another route that it comes into my body. And then I have ingestion on the bottom left-hand side here. Ingestion is kind of the example I mentioned on the last slide, where, say, I'm working with, just call it my bleach water mixture, and I get it on my hands, and I decide to, go eat lunch, and I don't wash them, and bleach might not be the best example here, but whatever chemical you're using, you get it on your hands, it's going to transfer over to whatever you're going to eat, right, if you don't wash them. Or you might be spraying that chemical in the air, and if I've got an open beverage container, maybe an open can of soda or just an open glass of water or something along those lines, that can land in the beverage as well, and that might be another way that I ingest it. And then finally, I've got injection here. An injection would be, potentially I'm taking trash out, and maybe somebody threw a needle in there and I get a needle stick. That would be a form of injection. Or maybe I step on a nail, it's a rusty nail. That would be a form of injection that comes into my body. So these are the 4 different ways that chemicals or different agents can be brought into your body. Now, of the 4, the two most common that you're going to run into are going to be inhalation and absorption. And it kind of just depends on the work that you're doing and the industry that you're in. But those are going to be the top two most common routes of exposure. So when we talk about chemical labeling, there's a few different responsibilities. There's going to be supplier responsibilities. So the manufacturer has a certain set of responsibilities that they need to do. There's going to be employer responsibilities. And then as an employee, you have certain responsibilities as well. So a supplier's responsibilities are going to be to provide a supplier label for every hazardous product that they import or bring into the country. So they're going to have that label. They're going to have the pictograms that we're going to talk about. It's going to be compliant that way. And then they're also required to provide that safety data sheet for every hazardous material that they import or they manufacture. So again, typically there may be a physical copy that comes with that when you bring it into the building, or again, it's all done kind of electronically these days. As an employer or a buyer, there's a few responsibilities as well. So in this particular situation, the buyer refers to you as an employer, like I mentioned, the organization that buys the hazardous material for use in the workplace. That's going to be the employer/buyer. Their responsibilities are to ensure that the safety data sheets are easy for workers to find and read. So employees need to be trained on where to find them and have easy access to them. And then they need to ensure that all containers of hazardous materials in the workplace are labeled properly. Okay, so we talked about labeling in one of the previous slides. And then provide training on WHMIS in consultation with the Joint Health and Safety Committee or a health and safety representative. So that's what we're doing today here. We're doing training on the WHMIS program. And then as a worker, your worker rights or your duty as a worker is to participate in this training, refuse the work that you believe is dangerous, like we talked about on one of the first couple of slides. Know about the hazardous materials that you work with. So as an employee, again, familiarize yourself with the chemicals that you're working with every day or any of these agents you might be exposed to, and kind of learn about those and reference the safety data sheets and such. And then consult with the safety committee and management and make sure that you're helping out that way. So again, that right to participate that we talked about at the beginning. All right, so I mentioned earlier that we're going to get into just a little bit about infectious agents. So on the left-hand side of the screen, we see bacteria, we see virus, fungus, parasites. Obviously we're dealing with COVID-19 right now. When we talk about infectious agents, we're talking about bloodborne pathogens. That might be HIV, that might be hepatitis A, B, C, all of those things. And really what I want to point out on this slide is what's called universal precautions. So we've kind of got this big graphic on the side that says universal precautions. And what that means is if you're ever in a situation where you are exposed to bloodborne, well, let's just say blood or potentially infectious material like that, what you want to do is make sure you're protecting yourself. So if I have an employee and they come up to me and they say, Scott, I cut myself, the first thing that I'm going to do is probably verbally coach them, right? And say, hey, you know what, it looks like you cut your finger. Why don't you put some pressure on it? Raise it above your heart. Basically, I can verbally guide them, but I want to make sure I'm protecting myself. So I'm not going to dive in and I'm not going to start, applying pressure myself. What I want to do is go get gloves, right? Hit the first aid kit, come back, make sure that I'm protected. And then at that point, I might be able to come in and start, applying pressure or, Band-Aids or gauze or, whatever it happens to be, then I can start helping. So the whole idea behind universal precautions is that before I help anyone, I'm going to assume that that person could be infected. And that's not always the case. Obviously, not everybody's going to be infected. But if I make that assumption every time, I'm going to make sure that I'm protecting myself and I keep myself safe from infection. All right, so then I also mentioned that I would talk about physical agents a little bit. So we covered the infectious agents, but let's get into physical a little bit more. So you see on the screen, we've kind of got the noise symbol on the left-hand side, so excessive noise. In the middle, we have kind of a snowflake, so colder situations. And then we have the flame on the right-hand side, so excessive heat. So kind of to start, when we talk about excessive noise, generally what we talk about for excessive noise is a decibel range of around 85 decibels. And what does that sound like? You might ask yourself what 85 decibels sounds like. And really what that is if I'm standing away from you, probably about 3 feet or maybe arm's length, and we have to shout in order to hear each other, depending on what's going on around us, that's going to be right at that level where I need some sort of hearing protection, probably, right? I'm right at that 85 decibels or that 90 decibel level. Heat stress. Really what we want to look for here is if somebody is kind of in the situation where they need some help because they're overheated, maybe they're working outside, maybe we're indoors and we're just working really hard and kind of the ambient temperature is high. If that person stops sweating, that's the main sign that we want to look for, and we want to get them some medical help right away. So there may be some other things that come up. For instance, they might be pale or they might start to become incoherent. And yes, we want to potentially get them help at that point too. But if somebody stops sweating, a person's ability to control their own temperature once they've stopped sweating, that goes away. That's the body's natural cooling system. So at that point, we need to get them some immediate medical attention and get their core body temperature down as quickly as possible. And when we're at that type of temperature level, that's when the brain is starting to approach some really dangerous levels too, where there could be some potential long-term damage. All right. So physical stuff, we've got heat, we've got noise, and then we've got on the opposite end, we've got cold stress. And cold stress, if you're working in, again, outdoor, real cold conditions, signs of that might be disorientation, skin turning blue, frostbite. So those types of things, again, we want to make sure we get somebody medical attention as quickly as possible. All right. So kind of a lot of information so far. Does anybody have any questions before I move on? All right. So I mentioned earlier the globally harmonized system, and that's going to tie in obviously with WHMIS. So again, in 2015, they brought this in. And what you're going to see on the next screen or the next few slides here are going to be the different chemical symbols that we've seen in the past, and then that we've kind of brought in as part of the new system. All right. All right, the first is going to be the gas cylinder. So we saw this as an example earlier, but this is compressed gas or gases under pressure. The whole thing with gases under pressure is that there can be a lot of stored energy in this. So you might see a lot of, propane tanks might have this. Really any cylinder. You might even see this symbol on like a can of spray paint might have it, right? Because there's compressed, it's kind of compressed into a can. So you might see that on there as well. Here's the old symbol. So we've kind of got the black circle with a compressed gas cylinder in the middle. What we're migrating to, and what you'll see with all of these pictograms, is the sort of red diamond shape here, and then the black silhouette in the middle. So very similar, but you might see either of these on a compressed gas cylinder. Flammable or flame, you'll see this as well. Again, very similar. We've got the diamond on the left-hand side, the circle on the right, but a very similar, kind of a very straightforward symbol that if you see it on something, it's going to be flammable. Flame over circle. Flame over circle is a little bit different. This is what's known as an oxidizer. And if you see this on something, an oxidizer is an agent that when it burns, it puts off oxygen. So if you think about a fire needs oxygen, it needs a heat source, and it needs an energy source, or a fuel source rather, to burn. So when we're introducing more oxygen into it, that fire is going to burn hotter and it's going to burn faster. So this is kind of, the flame 2.0. If this agent has the oxidizer symbol, like you see here, the O with the flames on top of it, if it does start on fire, it's going to burn a lot hotter and faster than something else might. What we see here is corrosive. Again, very similar symbols, just slightly different with the way it's arranged there, but you can see that corrosive can cause damage to both skin. It can cause damage to eyes. It can cause damage to metal. So it just kind of depends on what the particular, what it comes into contact with. And then here we have skull and crossbones. So skull and crossbones can be acutely dangerous. So we talked about acute and chronic at the beginning. So this is poisonous, toxic in a short amount of time. This can cause a lot of damage. We have the exclamation mark. Now this is a little bit newer symbol, again in 2015 bringing it in. So there wasn't necessarily a symbol for this previously. But basically what you can remember with this is what's known as an irritant. So You get this on your skin, you breathe it in, it's going to be mildly irritating. You might get a rash. It might turn your skin red. It might not be the most pleasant thing. And that's what the exclamation point stands for. My way of remembering this is it's an upside down I. So if you take that exclamation point and you flip it around, that's I for irritant. We also have cancer-causing agents. So I mentioned that on one of the first slides. And what you see here is a health hazard. So this is cancer-causing, mutagenic. You might see this. So it's sort of a human silhouette with kind of that star in the middle. And then we have the exploding bomb or reactive. So previously you've got kind of this R in the circle. So you may see this, and now we've moved to the exploding bomb, which I think is fairly straightforward. So if we're dealing with anything like this in the workplace or you see it, that may be something we want to bring up to management, or we want to work to either replace or eliminate if we think back to that hierarchy of controls that we talked about. And we have environmental damage as well. So environmental, this is, well, substances within this pictogram have the ability to kill or damage living things within an ecosystem or an environment. So if we see this on something, we want to think about probably how we're disposing of that chemical. It's probably not something that we can just dump down the drain like we might do something else. There's going to be special things that we need to take into consideration and make sure that we're thinking about before we just dump it down the drain. And then lastly, we have biohazardous infectious material. So these materials basically can cause diseases in people or animals, can cause infections. So these can be organisms or toxins or things like that, but basically things that can get into the bloodstream and be infectious. All right, so just going to check and see if we have any questions quickly. If we don't, it looks like we're good. Feel free to chime in the chat or just ask questions if you do have any. But that's the WHMIS system. That's the GHS as it ties into that. And then to wrap up here, we're going to talk about what we call some protective measures, or in general, just some good safety things to remember. All right, so the first thing that we want to talk about, and just kind of keep in mind on a daily basis, whether you're at work, you're at home, is safe lifting. So if we look at the screen here, this guy's doing a few things really well. When he's lifting a heavy load, he's using his legs and he's keeping his back straight. And when somebody does that and they're lifting properly, we're going to see kind of what's called this natural S shape. Sorry, it's natural S shape right here. Okay, so using legs, keeping his back straight, and he's also keeping the load close to his body. So he's doing those three things really well. Those are really good safe lifting practices. He's doing a couple other things really well too. He's keeping his head straight. He's watching where he's going. He's also got a hard hat on, which is good practice depending on the situation you're in. So those are good safe lifting practices to keep in mind. Personal protective equipment. Really what I want to touch on here is that when you are first hired, if there's any personal protective equipment that you need for your particular job, maybe it's cut resistant gloves, maybe it's nitrile gloves to protect you from a chemical you might be using, maybe it's hearing protection, kind of all these things that we might see on the right hand side of the screen here. We want to receive training on that. So as an employee, you should receive training on that initially when you get hired. And then if there's any changes in the workplace, maybe there's a new process or maybe a new machine or something that you're using that may require different type of goggles, different type of protection. We would want to do some training on that as well so that we all know how to operate and use our PPE properly. Electrical safety, I think that I myself am guilty, and I think many of us are guilty of kind of this middle picture right here. So from an electrical safety standpoint, when we talk about extension cords and we talk about surge protectors like you see here, surge protectors are really designed, in general, I mean, there's some exceptions, but in general, they're designed for low voltage stuff, computers, printers, things like that. And when we get into a situation where we're plugging in multiple devices, we're putting in a three-way plug to it, we're starting to overload that surge protector, and it's not designed for that. So when you start to overload it, then you start looking at potential fire hazards, right? Again, because it's not designed for it. Other things, extension cords, when you start plugging more than one extension cord together, or say you plug a surge protector into an extension cord, that also creates a fire hazard because you're creating more resistance the longer it gets, the longer the electrical run gets. And then this also presents an electrical or fire hazard in the upper right hand side of the screen here. So if you have a damaged electrical cord, whether it's a call it a plug on a vacuum or just anything in the office, or it's an extension cord, either way, if there's exposed wiring, we want to remove that from service as quickly as possible and either get that repaired or purchase new and just make sure that we're keeping ourselves safe that way, so there's no electrical shock hazard, electrocution hazard, or fire hazard. We want to talk a little bit about emergency action planning. So what you would do in the event of severe weather or a fire. So when we talk about severe weather in general, a severe weather warning is going to be issued. At that point, anyone that's on site, be it employees or visitors, they're going to move to designated severe weather areas. And if you have questions as to where your designated severe weather area might be, I'd recommend that you talk to management. They've got that all laid out. They've got that mapped out and planned. So again, if you're unfamiliar, check with them and they can help you out. In the situation, once we've gone outside to the designated area, I'm sorry. For severe weather, likely for a tornado, it won't be outside. It'll be a designated severe weather area inside. Outside would be for fire, which we'll get into on the next slide. Once we get to that designated area, management's going to monitor the situation and then instruct employees where to go and then what to do as kind of the situation progresses. Once the severe weather has passed, let's call it a tornado, an all clear page is going to be issued, and then anyone on site can return to the work area. In the event of a fire, we're going to immediately evacuate the building using the closest exit. And again, we want to make sure that we know where the designated area is. So, just to clarify on the last slide, severe weather area, that's going to be a designated area within the building. When we get into a fire, there's going to be a designated area outside the building where we want everybody to meet. And the idea is, in the event of a fire, everybody goes out. We can count everybody, do a head count, make sure that everybody's there. If they're not, we can take appropriate action. As we're exiting, we want to make sure that we close any fire doors if you're the last person leaving an area, if time allows. And then again, stand with your department head, make sure that they can do the appropriate head count. In the event that a supervisor or manager, your primary supervisor isn't there, there will be a designated backup person in the event of an emergency to do that head count and again, make sure that everybody is safe and accounted for. A little bit more about fire safety when we talk about fire extinguishers. A few things we want to consider. One, there should be an annual maintenance check done on these, and that maintenance check is typically done by a company that's going to come in. They're going to make sure that the tank is full. You've got extinguishing fluid in there or chemical or whatever that agent happens to be based on the extinguisher. They're going to make sure that the pin is in place, the handle's working properly, the tank is in good shape, the integrity of the tank. So they're going to come in on an annual basis and do that. And then on a monthly basis, we might go around, most companies go around and they'll check the extinguisher just to make sure that it is holding a charge and then that pin is in place. Because what can happen is people can use these in the event of a fire. And believe it or not, I've unfortunately seen it where somebody uses it and they put out a real small fire, don't use the whole extinguisher, and they hang it back up on the wall. Well, the problem with that is these fire extinguishers on average generally have about a 30-second extinguishing kind of time frame. So you don't have a lot of time. They're not built to put out big fires. They're kind of built to put out what are called incipient fires. So real small fires that are just starting. Now, if I hang that up on the wall after using it, the next person that goes to use it is obviously probably not going to be in a good situation, right? Because they don't have the full extinguishing capability of the extinguisher. So if we use it, we want to make sure that we tell management about it, it gets filled up. And in general, it's good to do a monthly check on these just to make sure that nobody did use them and that we're in good shape. The other thing I want to point out about fire extinguishers, if you're ever in a situation where you need to use it, and again, this would only be if it's an incipient fire, just starting small, you feel like you can put it out with an extinguisher, we want to use what's called the PASS method. And PASS stands for pull, aim, squeeze, and sweep. So first thing I'm going to do is pull. I'm going to pull the pin out of the extinguisher. I'm going to aim. and then I'm going to squeeze and I'm going to sweep. So I'm going to squeeze and sweep back and forth with that handle. And that's just a real simple method in the event of emergency. Things get a little bit chaotic. You see the fire. If you feel like you can put it out, try to remember the pass method. And then finally here we've got an eye wash station. So you might have an eye wash station on site there. There's a few different kinds. Generally, the most common is going to be what you see in the middle there. And it might be green. Sometimes they're yellow. There's different styles. But basically, these are kind of portable stations that mount to the wall. And they have about 6 gallons worth of fluid in there. And it's good for about a 15-minute eye wash, which in general, a lot of hazardous chemicals are going to say, hey, you need to wash your eyes for 15 minutes if you get them in there. So those are really good for that. You might also see sometimes what you see on the right-hand side, which is a hard plumb station. And hard plumb stations are good in that there's a continuous water source, right? So you don't have to worry about changing the water or filling the water. So these are a couple different examples of what can be present in the workplace. Generally, again, you're going to see what's in the middle. If you are dealing with what's in the middle, again, we need to make sure that liquid is kind of in there. If somebody uses it, it needs to get replenished. And ideally, we're inspecting this on a certain schedule to make sure that those things are happening. On the right-hand side with the hard plumbed, what can happen with these is if it's not kind of exercised, if you don't turn it on and kind of run the water periodically, just like we would if, water sat in our house, we didn't run a certain tap for a while, there might be sediment that can build up here. And now this is an extreme example, but this would be a case where nobody has kind of exercised or tested or inspected this particular station in a while. And here's the reason that we do it. So you can see here that it's not the most ideal thing, right? We probably don't want that kind of water getting into our eyes. The whole idea is to flush out our eyes and get the chemical out of there. But it kind of reinforces the importance of doing the inspections, whether we have the portable one that was in the middle or the hard plumb station on the right-hand side. All right, so we have one more video that I'm going to show. But before we jump into that, does anybody have any questions?
Throughout this video, we'll be walking through
Scott, I was just going to jump in about this video for everyone. This is just a quick 6 minutes long. It's the updated COVID safety protocol video for the Toronto office. So we're kind of checking all the safety box trainings all in this one training session. So nice and sweet, but I just wanted to kind of say what it was at first before we start playing it.
Perfect, thank you. All right.
COVID-19 safety protocols and how to stay safe and healthy while working on site. By the end of this video, you should know the safety protocols in place and the important role that you play. Welcome back to MultiTech. Or if you've recently joined MultiTech.
Are you able to hear the audio on this?
Yep.
You are, okay, perfect.
Welcome to the team. First and foremost, we're happy to see you in the office again. Before traveling to work, if you don't feel well, please stay home. We can't deliver top-notch performance if we're not well. Take care of yourself. Simply let your manager know how you're feeling. If you suspect you have COVID-19 or known exposure to COVID-19, your manager will notify HR, and an assigned case manager on our HR team will take it from there and guide you through our process. While MultiTech has 2 entrances to this building, we ask that all employees use the main entrance. You will see our wellness scanning kiosk as soon as you walk in the front door. Upon starting the day, you will be required to complete a wellness check. This is a 2-step process you'll need to complete daily. First is answering a health questionnaire, and second is scanning your temperature. Step 1, answering the health questionnaire. You'll need to use your mobile phone's camera, scan the QR code located next to the kiosk. See the questions will offer you answer, such as have you been exposed to COVID-19 and be well enough to work. Accurately answer questions. A QR code will pop up on your mobile phone screen. Then you will point your screen at the temperature scan kiosk. Step 2, scanning your temperature. Welcome to kiosk interfaces. If the temperature recorded is within a healthy range, the system will report a pass-through. You may proceed into the building. In the event the temperature registers 100 degrees or above, the system will alarm and report failed reading. At that time, we are requiring you to immediately exit the building and communicate with your manager or appropriate MultiTech person. Whenever a failed reading is recorded, your temperature and a red photo is passed along human resources, and we will follow up with you accordingly. Don't worry about remembering all of this on day 1. Practice makes perfect, and printed step-by-step instructions are attached to each temperature scan kiosk. Step 3, assuming the kiosk reports a pass-through, you can now continue into the building, head to your office or work. We have several controls to minimize the spread and transmission of COVID-19, which we will outline now. Face masks. MultiTech will follow Ben's CDC, the Ministry of Labor, and the Department of Health with their current recommendations. At this time, masks still must be worn by anyone on site, and MultiTech has face masks available for everyone employed on site. We request that all MultiTech employees adhere to these face mask guidelines. Next, meetings. Distancing is still a great way to minimize transmission. While you're in meetings and socialize, please maintain a 2-meter physical distance when possible. We've established limited capacities for meeting rooms. Please follow those limits. Also, don't feel required to attend meetings in person just because you're in the office. We've had great success with virtual meetings and encourage you to however feel most comfortable. Next, hand washing. Eating and acting. Washing your hands regularly is always preferred infection prevention. You'll also notice hand sanitizer stations located all throughout the building for hand hygiene. Speaking of hand washing, you should wash your hands for at least 20 seconds with soap and water frequently throughout the day, but especially before and after meal times after using restrooms. Instructions on how to properly clean hands will be referenced in every break room and restroom. Please use respiratory etiquette by covering your mouth and nose when coughing or sneezing, and properly dispose of used tissues. Again, same if you're not well. Next, clean your ears. Office work surfaces such as chairs, electronics, phones, tools, messages, workbenches, take a few, all your opportunity in the day. Stay first break on highway. If you have a shared environment, this is over 2 times a day. Please take a foundation and being safe outside is a great reminder. MultiTech limits its efforts ensuring your safety. We have a contracted cleaning crew disinfecting all high-tech surfaces, common areas, restrooms, and break areas after hours. And building maintenance team ensures ventilation and airflow is clean, with regularly scheduled maintenance of our on-site air handling system. If you ever need more disinfectant supplies, hand sanitizer, masks, Kleenex, or other items, please request them from Susan, and she will make sure you have what you need. If you have any questions or concerns related to your safety or health, please talk to your supervisor, and they will follow up with HR. We encourage you to provide recommendations to your managers on how we can continue to improve our efforts. For details about our safety protocols, a full COVID-19 preparedness plan can be referenced on our shared drive, and detailed instructions will be sent to you as a follow-up to this training. As a reminder, we all play a role in ensuring the health and safety of one another and the MultiTech organization as a whole. And every MultiTech employee is expected to comply with all aspects of our response to COVID-19. In the event there is a confirmed positive case of COVID-19 or a direct exposure of an employee, MultiTech will take the necessary action to ensure that your safety is our top priority. Things change constantly. We have a cross-function team in place, reviewing all recommendations and updates, ensuring all of our employees feel MultiTech is a safe and healthy place to be. It's great to see you here at our Toronto location. And again, welcome back.
That's the only thing I was just gonna add quick to is that the QR code reader with the questionnaire is now live. So at the kiosk, if you want help just doing that for the first time, Carrie and I will be available. It's pretty straightforward, but you do have to do the QR code reader and then let the kiosk read your question QR code that will then pop up on your phone. So if you want help doing that for the first time, we're here to help do some mini training sessions if you'd like that. And then Scott, that's all I have. So.
All right, perfect. Yeah, and that's all I have. I appreciate everybody's time. Does anybody have any questions before we go today? If you don't mind, and if you didn't have a chance, throw your name in the chat. Just put your first and last name. That helps us kind of make sure that everybody is accounted for. And other than that, have a good day.